Hi everyone, I'm a bit behind with my coverage of Tata. I assume that most of you know Carlsen has won the tournament with an incredible 10 out of 13. It was an amazing performance and I will be getting to one of his most interesting games next time. I still owe you 2 games from the tournament, and so I thought we'd look at one of them now. It was played in round 11 between the young Dutch player Anish Giri, rated 27-20 and 18 years old, and another young player, Fabiano Caruana of Italy, rated 27-81 and 20 years old. Giri had white and he opened with d4, to which Caruana answered d5, and after c4, e6 we have the orthodox Queen's Gambit declined, which was massively popular throughout the 20th century at all levels, and still is. Play continued with one of the many book lines, knight f3, c6, knight c3, and now the interesting d takes c4. Black wins a pawn but gives up his center, as white now has a pawn on d4 and also control of e4, which black has given up with this move, so white can play e4 as and when he likes to. So what is black up to doing this? Well, the point is that he has won a pawn and white will have to take time to win it back, meaning that black can try and do something in the meantime. The fact that he has played c6 means that he can aim for a later b5 in order to support this c-pawn. So to prevent that move, Giri played a4, which is a standard idea in many lines of the Queen's Gambit accepted. Caruana continued with bishop b4. White's last move has weakened this square permanently, because a piece on b4 can no longer be kicked back by a pawn. And black scores pretty well in these lines. Some databases even have black as scoring better from this position. Giri is something of an expert in the Catalan lines, and the game transposed to exactly that after his next move, g3. Although strictly speaking it would be classified as a Catalan with some early deviations. Giri's plan is of course to play bishop g2, giving his king a very safe home tucked in behind the Fian shadow bishop, and also taking aim down the long diagonal, which makes it dangerous and more weakening for black to play b5 if he's really going to go down that road. And the bishop and the rook on a8 is one problem, but it would also mean that white has long-term pressure and control along the long diagonal and on black's queen side. Caruana continued development with knight f6, and this pin with bishop b4 pinning the knight is taking control of e4 away from white, so this is a logical follow-up to further gain control of e4. And obviously if white were to play e4 now, then the knight could just take, because the knight on c3 is pinned. And playing e4 is a little double-edged anyway, because it leaves d4 slightly weak, and you know, in a lot of lines white is wise to just play e3 for the time being and maybe play e4 later. Loses tempo but it's safer. It depends how black wants to play. And as far as black is concerned, he's got a claim to something in the opening, the e4 square, and you know, having a claim out of the opening with black is always a good thing. So bishop g2 from Giri, which you know is just continuing logical development, and now knight b d7. Caruana also continues development, and in many lines black will aim to land a knight on d5, which will give him some pressure in the position and some play, and nicely posted central knight is a good thing 99% of the time. Now both sides castled, and Giri played queen c2, which takes back control of e4, and this is one of the squares that the players are fighting for control over at the moment. And this move queen c2 is multi-purpose. It also aims for the c4 pawn as well. So Caruana continued with queen a5, which is an interesting development for the queen. There are many possibilities along the 5th rank, and it's also prophylaxis against certain moves like knight e5, which is now going to drop a pawn If knight takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes e5, and so on. And it also allows for the b5 push, because the a pawn is now pinned with the queen eyeing the rook. So it's clear that black is trying to give white some problems to solve and some things to think about. Giri continued with knight a2, attacking the bishop, and Caruana doesn't want to give it up or he'll be weak on the dark squares, so he played bishop d6, again controlling e5 and allowing the pawn to be regained by queen takes c4, but it's only temporarily giving the pawn back, because now comes knight b6, which forks the queen and the a pawn, which the black queen is attacking, and this was another idea in queen a5. So, you know, it's all very nice play from Caruana. Giri brought his queen back to c2, and now came queen takes e4. And the queen, you know, from a5 is facing the rook where it is, so for this reason and others, Giri didn't want to trade queens, so he played b3, as he might have on the black queen later. And at this moment the evaluation of the engine is at 0, meaning that white has good compensation for the pawn, and that's clearly the case due to his extra space on the queen side, pressure on the black position. Most of the white pieces are working. It won't be long before the knight comes in, and meanwhile black is kind of hemmed in and restricted in getting his pieces out, especially the light square bishop, and both the rooks also hemmed in, so you know there's definite compensation for white here. So Caruana played queen a5. He's got to move his queen, and this retains the pin on the knight, because if it moves, obviously then the rook on a1 is falling. And now Giri got a nicely centralized piece with knight e5, which is a good move, because it appears that black can simply win a pawn by trading here on e5 twice. Caruana, however, thought better of it and played instead knight b d7, which is the correct move. There's an instructive series of events if you want to try and figure out why he did not capture instead on e5 at this point. Why didn't black win a pawn on e5? If you want to figure out why, then stop the video now. The reason why is because after bishop takes e5, white has the powerful intermezzo bishop d2 instead of immediately capturing back on e5. And moves like this are amongst the most common that players of all levels miss during their games, immediately assuming that they must recapture straight away. If you can remember to stop yourself from doing this, it is always worth considering if there's a better move you can play in between your opponent capturing your piece and you recapturing his. The point here is that the queen on a5 is running decidedly low on squares. Queen b5 is the only viable move, but now comes a second as intermezzo, knight c3, which again leaves the queen with only one square. It's b4. And once the queen has been brought into the game, it's sometimes advisable to ensure that there's always a way out of it. Caruana playing knight b6 has sealed off the queen's escape route that she came into the game on, and it's just something you have to keep an eye on. Sometimes situations like this can arise. Of course, Caruana didn't fall into it during the game, but it's one of those things that you don't always consider, and obviously it's good to keep an eye out for it. So the queen is now forced to line up with the bishop on d2, which means that after black finally recaptures with d takes e5, there's no queen takes e5, which in theory was going to win the pawn beforehand. And as I said, the queen on b4 is lined up against the bishop on d2, so that creates some problems. Like, for example, after knight fd7, if knight d5, then knight takes d5, and it would discover an attack on the queen, so it would win a piece for white. But now white has the powerful move knight d5 anyway, because it discovers an attack on the queen, so obviously the knight can't be taken. And once again, there's only one reasonable square. c5 isn't an option due to queen takes c5, knight takes c5, and then knight takes b6, exploiting the pin between the a1 rook and the a8 rook, so that would win a piece for white. So the queen has to go to g4. Now will come bishop f3, again forcing queen h3, queen f5, then knight e7 check, wins the queen. So the black queen ends up on a ridiculous square now, and her troubles are not over. Additionally, white has huge initiative for the pawn, which he can now win back by force and continue his attack with something like knight c7, attacking the rook. So say rook b8, and now bishop b4, attacking the other rook. And you know, it forces black to give up a pawn or go the exchange down, because there's no safe squares for this rook. If it goes to d8, then bishop e7 is going to win it. Obviously it can't go to e8 because of the knight. So c5 would be forced. Now bishop takes c5, knight takes c5, queen takes c5, and there's ongoing pressure, and all the play in the position is white's. So Caruana did well to avoid this line. Obviously he wouldn't have seen this deep, but he would have seen that there were problems with his queen being attacked and being shifted around, and white gaining tempo and, you know, moving the queen around and just creating this kind of play. It's exactly the kind of thing you have to be careful won't happen when you bring a queen into the game. So if we go back to the game continuation anyway, after knight e5, Caruana played knight b d7, and now he's properly challenging to take on e5. Okay, that's the end of part 1.